In the vast realm of human cognition, our brains, while impressive, are not infallible. Often, they take shortcuts, leading us to form judgments and make decisions based on incomplete or skewed information. To truly understand these mental tendencies, here's a deeper dive into 20 cognitive biases with explanations, psychological reasons, and relevant real-life examples. This exploration sheds light on the intricate ways our minds operate, helping us navigate the complexities of decision-making with greater awareness. Before we dive in, if you find this content valuable, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below. It truly helps us grow. Now, let's get started. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias refers to the tendency of individuals to seek out, interpret, and remember information that directly supports their pre-existing views and opinions. This means that instead of objectively assessing new information or evidence, a person with this bias tends to cherry-pick facts that reinforce their already held convictions. From a cognitive standpoint, this bias arises as a mechanism to conserve mental energy. Constantly challenging our beliefs requires cognitive effort. Additionally, humans innately desire consistency and coherence in their thought processes, which leads them to unconsciously prefer information that aligns with what they already believe. Consider the scenario where someone is deeply rooted in their political stance. Instead of diversifying their media consumption, they might solely tune into news channels or websites that support their viewpoint, effectively creating an echo chamber around them. This selective exposure ensures their beliefs remain unchallenged, further entrenching their perspectives. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias, often termed the I knew it all along effect, is a cognitive trap where individuals believe, after an event has occurred, that they had accurately predicted or expected it beforehand. This retrospective belief in one's own foresight can distort memory and overshadow the unpredictability of the event at its initial occurrence. The human brain inherently seeks patterns and coherent narratives to make sense of the world. After learning the outcome of an event, our memory tends to reorganize and reconstruct prior knowledge, making it align seamlessly with the current reality. This simplifies complex situations and helps maintain our self-perception of competence and foresight. Suppose an investor had diversified their portfolio across various stocks. When the market takes a downturn affecting a particular industry, and the investor's stocks in that sector drop, they might assert, "I knew these stocks were risky." Yet, they had still chosen to invest in them at the time, without any certain anticipation of the downturn. This reflection post-event is an illustration of hindsight bias, as the investor retroactively justifies their prior decisions based on the new information. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut wherein people judge the likelihood or importance of something based on how easily it comes to mind. This typically means that recent experiences or vivid memories disproportionately influence our perceptions and decisions. For instance, when individuals frequently encounter specific information or are exposed to impactful events, they tend to perceive them as more prevalent or significant than they truly are. Our brains are wired for efficiency. Relying on immediate, readily available information conserves cognitive resources. This is why events that are recent or emotionally charged, which are stored more accessibly in our memory, are recalled faster and often perceived as more representative than they are in reality. Imagine someone who just finished watching a series of documentaries about plane crashes. Even though statistically, air travel is incredibly safe, this individual might momentarily feel hesitant about boarding a plane, falsely equating the frequency of their exposure to plane crash documentaries with the actual likelihood of such an event. Similarly, after seeing extensive media coverage on shark attacks, a person might think these incidents are commonplace, even if they're statistically rare, and hesitate to swim in the ocean during a beach vacation. Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is a cognitive phenomenon where individuals give disproportionate weight to the first piece of information they encounter, often using it as a reference point for subsequent judgments. This initial piece of information, or anchor, skews perception and can influence decision-making, even if later information suggests a different course of action or evaluation. Our brains seek patterns and references to simplify complex decision-making processes. By setting an initial benchmark, we create a starting point for comparisons, even if that point is arbitrary or unrelated. This reliance on the anchor helps in quickly navigating through vast amounts of information, but at the risk of potential inaccuracies. If someone is shopping and comes across a shirt originally priced at $100 but now marked down to $60, they might perceive it as a bargain due to the initial high price serving as an anchor. However, if they had first seen a similar shirt priced at $50 elsewhere, their perception of the $60 shirt's value would likely differ. The anchor, in this case the original price, heavily influences their evaluation of the deal. Self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is the tendency for individuals to attribute their successes to internal characteristics, like skill or effort, while attributing failures to external circumstances beyond their control. This cognitive distortion allows people to maintain a positive self-image and shields them from negative self-evaluation. Central to our psychological well-being is our self-esteem. By selectively attributing outcomes in a way that favors our self-image, we safeguard our self-worth and mental well-being. Recognizing our own flaws or mistakes can be psychologically distressing, so we often resort to explanations that externalize the blame. Consider the student who receives an A on a test and attributes it to their diligent study habits. However, when they score poorly on another test, they might blame the teacher's unclear instructions or claim the exam was unfairly difficult. Similarly, in the workplace, a manager might take credit for a project's success, citing their leadership, but if the project fails, they could point fingers at inadequate resources, team members, or unforeseen market conditions. This bias, while protective of one's self-image, can hinder personal growth and accountability. Status quo bias. Status quo bias is the psychological inclination to resist change, leading individuals to prefer the current situation or state of affairs. This means that, in many cases, maintaining the status quo feels more comfortable than making a change, even if the change could bring about better results or outcomes. The human brain is geared towards minimizing effort and uncertainty. Change inherently brings about a degree of uncertainty and requires the expenditure of cognitive resources to evaluate and adapt. By defaulting to the known and familiar, the brain conserves energy and reduces the potential stress and unpredictability that can come with new choices or situations. Consider someone using an old smartphone model. They're well aware that newer models with advanced features and better efficiency are available. Yet, they opt to keep their current phone. Their reasoning might be avoiding the hassle of transferring data, learning a new operating system, or simply an emotional comfort with the familiar device. This choice, influenced by the status quo bias, keeps them from benefiting from technological advancements, demonstrating how the preference for familiarity can sometimes override logical decision-making. Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias wherein individuals with low ability or knowledge in a particular area mistakenly believe they possess greater competence than they actually do. Conversely, highly competent individuals might underestimate their ability, thinking tasks are just as easy for others as they are for them. This effect stems from a lack of self-awareness and metacognition. People with limited knowledge or skill often don't possess the necessary expertise to recognize their own shortcomings. On the flip side, experts can take their deep understanding for granted, assuming it's common knowledge. Imagine someone who has just started learning about stock trading. After a few successful trades or reading a couple of investment books, they might feel overconfident, believing they have the skills to compete with seasoned investors. This misplaced confidence could lead them to make risky decisions without considering the depth and complexity of the financial markets. Similarly, a person who took a weekend workshop on a complex topic might feel they've mastered it, overlooking the vast nuances and intricacies known to true experts in the field. The Dunning-Kruger effect highlights the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of continuous learning and self-evaluation. Fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error describes our tendency to explain others' behaviors based on their inherent traits or character, while attributing our own actions to external circumstances. In other words, we often judge others harsher for their actions than we would judge ourselves in similar situations. This bias arises because it's cognitively simpler to label people based on observed behaviors than to consider the multitude of external factors influencing those actions. When it comes to our own actions, however, we have a more intimate understanding of the situational pressures and external variables at play, and thus give them more weight. Suppose the coworker snaps at you during a meeting. Instead of considering external factors like stress, personal issues, or work pressure, you might immediately label them as short-tempered or rude. However, if you were to snap at someone, you might justify it thinking, "I hadn't had my coffee," or "I was under so much stress from that deadline." This bias highlights our tendency to be less forgiving and understanding of others' actions, while being more lenient and understanding of our own behavior. It emphasizes the importance of empathy and considering external influences before making judgments. Endowment effect. The endowment effect is a cognitive bias where individuals ascribe greater value to things they own compared to identical items they do not possess. Simply by owning something, people often perceive it as more valuable, even if there's no objective increase in its worth. This effect stems from a deep-rooted sense of ownership and attachment. Owning an item often leads to it becoming a part of one's identity or intertwined with personal memories and emotions. The pain of losing something owned, or the thought of parting with it, can be disproportionately strong compared to the pleasure of acquiring something new or of equal value. Consider someone who has a coffee mug they've used for years. They might be presented with an opportunity to trade it for a newer, perhaps more efficient or aesthetically pleasing mug. Despite the clear benefits of the new mug, they might feel reluctant to part with their old one. This reluctance isn't necessarily because the old mug is objectively better, but because of the sentimental value and personal connection they've assigned to it. The endowment effect can often lead to seemingly irrational economic decisions, as personal sentiment clouds objective judgment. Bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect is a cognitive bias where people tend to adopt certain behaviors, beliefs, or actions primarily because many others are doing the same or believe in it. It's a form of groupthink where individuals follow the majority, often sidelining their own independent analysis or original thoughts. Humans are inherently social creatures, and there's an underlying need to fit in and be accepted by peers. Conforming to popular beliefs or trends can reduce feelings of isolation or exclusion. Additionally, there's an underlying assumption that if many people are doing something, it must be right or beneficial. Consider the launch of a new trendy gadget. Even if someone might not need it or find it particularly useful, seeing friends and influencers rave about it can induce a sense of FOMO, fear of missing out. This might push them to purchase the product simply to be part of the popular narrative and feel included. Similarly, in social media, people might adopt or support certain viewpoints or challenges primarily because they've gained traction, not necessarily because they've critically assessed them. The bandwagon effect underscores the powerful influence of social dynamics on individual decision-making. Loss aversion. Loss aversion refers to the psychological phenomenon where individuals feel the pain of a loss more acutely than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. In essence, the negative emotions associated with losing something are often more intense than the positive emotions tied to gaining something of the same value. From an evolutionary standpoint, avoiding losses has been crucial for survival. Potential losses, whether in terms of resources, status, or opportunities, could have dire consequences, making us wired to prioritize their avoidance. This cognitive predisposition ensures that potential threats or losses receive more attention and prompt more immediate action than potential gains. Imagine the scenario where someone misplaces their wallet and loses $20. The distress and disappointment they experience from this loss might be significantly stronger than the joy they'd feel if they found a $20 bill on the street. Similarly, investors might be more reluctant to sell a stock at a loss, even if it's the logical decision, simply because the emotional impact of realizing a loss is much harder to bear than missing out on potential gains. Loss aversion can lead to risk-averse behavior and might hinder individuals from making optimal decisions, especially when emotions overpower rational analysis. Framing effect. The framing effect refers to the phenomenon where people's decisions are influenced by the way information is presented rather than the information itself. The way data or options are framed can significantly sway our choices. Different frames evoke distinct emotional responses. Positive frames tend to elicit positive emotions and vice versa. Our brain processes information based on these emotional cues, often leading us to make decisions that align more with the emotion than the actual data. A classic illustration is when consumers prefer meat labeled as 95% lean over the same product labeled as 5% fat, even though the content is essentially the same. This preference arises because the former frame sounds healthier and more appealing, tapping into our positive emotional responses. Recency bias. Recency bias is the cognitive inclination to give more importance to the most recent events or information, often at the expense of earlier data. This means that individuals are more likely to be influenced by what has just happened, rather than taking a more comprehensive view. The reason behind this is largely due to memory processes. Recent events or information are fresher in our minds, making them easier to recall. As time passes, unless periodically revisited, memories tend to fade, making older events less prominent in our decision-making process. A manager might rate an employee's performance based on achievements or mistakes made in the past week, overlooking contributions or issues from earlier in the year. This can lead to skewed evaluations that don't accurately represent the employee's overall performance throughout the entire period. Groupthink. Groupthink is a psychological phenomenon where individuals within a group prioritize agreement and conformity over critical analysis of alternatives. It often leads to decisions that are suboptimal, as members suppress dissenting viewpoints or don't voice concerns to maintain group cohesion. The underlying reasons for groupthink include a strong desire for harmony within the group and an aversion to conflict. Additionally, individuals might fear exclusion or retaliation for going against the grain, especially if the group has strong leadership or a cohesive dynamic. Consider the corporate team that rushes into adopting a flawed business strategy. Even if some members have reservations or see potential pitfalls, they might remain silent, not wanting to be the lone voice of dissent. This lack of critical discussion and evaluation can lead the entire group down an unfavorable path. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is a cognitive trap where individuals persist in an action because of previously invested resources, such as time, money, or effort, even if it's no longer beneficial. It's the irrational commitment to a course of action based on the investment made, irrespective of the current or future value of that action. This bias stems from the innate human desire not to waste or lose what has already been invested. It's a defensive mechanism to protect ego and avoid the discomfort of admitting a bad decision or facing loss. Imagine buying a ticket to a movie, only to realize halfway through that it's not engaging. Instead of leaving and using the remaining time more productively, one might sit through the entire film just because they've paid for the ticket and invested time already, even though the cost won't be recovered by staying. Negativity bias. The negativity bias refers to the human tendency to give more weight to negative experiences, events, or information than to positive ones. This means that unpleasant occurrences often have a greater impact on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors than equally intense positive ones. From an evolutionary standpoint, this bias can be traced back to survival instincts. Recognizing and remembering threats or dangers was vital for the safety and survival of our ancestors. Thus, negative information was prioritized to help avoid those threats in the future. Imagine the student receiving feedback on a presentation. They might get 10 compliments but one piece of constructive criticism. Instead of focusing on the praise, they might ruminate on the single negative comment, allowing it to overshadow the multiple positive responses they received. This can influence their self-perception and future actions, underscoring the power of the negativity bias. Outcome bias. Outcome bias is the cognitive tendency to evaluate decisions based on their eventual outcomes instead of the quality or logic of the decision itself. This means individuals may praise or criticize decisions retroactively, based purely on what happened afterward, rather than whether the decision was sound at the time it was made. Outcomes are tangible and evident, making them easier to assess compared to the abstract reasoning behind a decision. People naturally gravitate toward concrete results as a benchmark, often overlooking the complexities or uncertainties present during decision-making. Imagine an investor who decides to pour money into a highly speculative stock without proper research. If the stock unexpectedly skyrockets, people might laud the investor for their brilliant choice, even if the decision itself was reckless. Conversely, if the stock plummets, the same decision could be labeled as foolish, despite the outcome being equally unpredictable. Ostrich effect. The ostrich effect describes the behavior where individuals deliberately avoid or ignore negative, undesirable, or uncomfortable information. It's akin to an ostrich burying its head in the sand, although this is a myth and ostriches don't actually do this. The root of this behavior lies in the innate human desire to avoid distress or discomfort. Facing negative information can trigger anxiety, shame, or other negative emotions. By ignoring it, individuals hope to delay or escape those feelings, even if it's not in their best interest long-term. Consider someone who's aware they've overspent this month. Instead of confronting their financial situation by checking their bank account or bills, they choose to avoid it, hoping that by not seeing the numbers, they can escape the immediate stress, even if it might lead to greater problems down the line. Placebo effect. The placebo effect refers to the phenomenon where individuals experience real improvements in their symptoms or conditions, not because of any active ingredient or treatment, but purely due to their belief and expectation that they are receiving an effective intervention. Our mind plays a powerful role in our overall well-being. When we genuinely believe that we are receiving a treatment that will help us, our brain can produce physiological changes that mimic or produce the expected results. This showcases how deeply intertwined our expectations and beliefs are with our physical and mental health outcomes. A patient participating in a clinical trial might be given a sugar pill with no therapeutic value but is told it's a potent painkiller. If they start to experience reduced pain after taking this pill, even though it lacks any active pain-relieving ingredients, it's a manifestation of the placebo effect. Their belief in the treatment's efficacy prompted genuine relief. Belief bias. Belief bias refers to the tendency where people evaluate the strength or validity of an argument based on the believability of its conclusion rather than the actual quality or logic of the argument itself. If a conclusion aligns with pre-existing beliefs, individuals are more likely to deem the argument as logical, even if it's flawed. Our brains favor cognitive ease, meaning we gravitate towards information that aligns with our pre-existing beliefs and values. It feels more comfortable and requires less cognitive effort to accept arguments that resonate with what we already think. Imagine someone deeply rooted in a particular political ideology. They might encounter a logically sound argument that challenges their beliefs but dismiss it outright, not because of its structure, but simply because the conclusion doesn't fit their worldview. Recognizing and understanding these biases, like belief bias, is essential. It allows individuals to step back, evaluate information more objectively, and make more informed decisions, fostering a more open-minded and analytical approach to diverse perspectives and ideas.